All right, so we left off last week, and I was about to get into the culture and lore. We were talking about the culture. I didn't get into the lore, so we're going to start off with that this week, and I'm going to try to go through it quick because we got a lot to go through today. Hope everyone's doing well. We have air today, yay! Time for air. Okay, so time for the mystical and supernatural side today. Frank says in the first episode, "Oh my dear, there's no place on earth with more magic and superstition mixed into its daily life than in the Scottish Highlands." And from the first episode, we're hit with a heavy dose of lore. The first line is also from the prologue of the book. People disappear all the time, and ends with disappearances have explanations, usually. And when Frank and Claire arrive in Inverness, Claire and Frank see blood smeared on the doorpost, and inside Mrs. Baird tells them that it's part of a sacrifice to honor St. Oran. Mrs. Baird tells them that their timing is good because they came on the festival of Samhain, which in the book was Beltane. They switched that up in the show, but it was supposed to be Beltane. And warns them ghosts are freed on the feast days, and they'll be wandering free to do good or evil. And then at Reverend Wakefield's, we have Mrs. Graham reading Claire's tea leaves and palm, telling her a confusing future, and then Frank sees a ghost. And then they go see Druids dance at the stones, and then later on she goes back to pick flowers, hits the stone, and disappears 200 years in the past. So that's a half hour into the show, and we had all that happening lore-wise. So it is definitely a place with a lot of lore. So let me play this for you. I hate the way that is.
Witchcraft has sort of been hovering around the edges of Claire's story from the very beginning.
There's no place on earth magic and superstition mix into this daily life in the Scottish Highlands.
Claire's belief in the power of reason and science is so strong within her that she almost is a little too cocky.
It's a baby. That baby is no human child, that's a changeling.
It's just superstitious nonsense.
There's always this hint that the Gaelis might be in touch with the supernatural.
They say I'm a witch.
Are you?
Gaelis is definitely a woman who believes in powers that are not known to everyone, and I think she even thinks she might probably have some influence on them.
There's many things in this world we can't explain. There's fairies, and there's witches, and there's paganism, and people just didn't really know what to believe because they knew so little back then.
Her cloak flapped open around her, and she leapt into the sky and flew like a great winged bird.
It continues to this day, that thing of people being suspicious of people who are different.
I shall dance upon your ashes.
This is a time and place that still believes very strongly in witchcraft.
Be gone, evil demon.
Claire is so sort of cynical, and she doesn't believe in any of that stuff, and yet she's the person who gets affected by it the most.
I smell the vapors of hell on you.
It's a very dangerous thing that Claire plays with when she refuses to accept the superstition of the time.
I'm the witch.
Okay, so here we have the Wheel of the Year, it's called. Are you guys familiar with this? Anybody familiar with the Wheel of the Year? No. Oh, good. All right. Okay, so this is basically the year in the Celtic and Druid lore, and it basically marks out all the what they call sabbats, which are the feast days, which is where sabbatical, the word sabbatical comes from. Which is the holidays that they celebrated. Now, there were two sets of feast days. There's sun feasts and fire feasts, and there's 4 of each. So the sun feasts are on the positioning of the sun. So they're basically your solstices and equinoxes, which are here, summer solstice, winter, spring, and fall. Okay, and they are based on the plant life, because everything is based on life force in the Celtic and Druid cultures. It's all based on life force and earth force and nature. And so these are called the lesser Sabbats, okay, the ones that are based on the solstice and the equinoxes. And does anybody have an idea why they're called lesser Sabbats? Anybody take a guess? Because of the two, the sun feasts are the less powerful days. They're based on the sun. They're masculine. Maybe that's why, you know. And the women like had the magic and all that. So maybe I had to do with it. But they're considered the lesser Sabbats, and they're orientated on the plant cycle, the plant life cycle, because everything's on a life cycle. So they're based on the plant cycle. I can't talk. Let me take a sip. And all of them are less powerful than the fire feasts, except for summer solstice, which is equal to Beltane and Samhain as far as powerful days in that culture, because it's the most powerful of those days because it's when the sun was up the longest. And so things that people, when they believed in things taking in the power of the sun, it had the sun the longest on those days. So that's why you'll see a lot of the standing stones are orientated with summer solstice, for it to hit a certain stone on summer solstice. So, okay, so a lot of these days, all of these Druid and Celtic days are now, a lot of them are moved over into Christian holidays when the Christians took over. So Yule became Christmas and so forth. Ostera became Easter, etc. Okay, so your fire feasts, which are the feast days in between the equinoxes, okay, are on the positioning of the moon. They're usually either when the moon is full or when the moon, three are on the full moon and one is on the new moon. So they orientate the life cycle of the animals. So when you would like slaughter the animals for winter, if they couldn't go through the winter for whatever reason, and you would slaughter them and salt them for the winter to go over the winter, that would happen on Samhain, which is like Halloween. And what happens is the reason these days are so powerful in worship is because they come in between the winter, the solstices and the equinoxes. So on the in-between days, anything that in this culture that falls in between or on the borders, that's all worshipped as holy and sacred and powerful. Where like the shore meets the water for the ocean, that line is considered powerful. Anything like that, any in-between time is a powerful time in this culture, and that's something in between holidays and I lost my track of thought. Doorways are another thing, is that's why they put things over thresholds, and that all comes from that lore of in between. So these feast days are important to understand for our story because this is when the portals are open in the time travel lore. Because on the feast days, the lines between worlds and realms are the thinnest. So that's when you can travel, that's when you can pass from, the ghosts can come into our world, that's when you can travel through time, that's when faeries can enter into different realms. All of that happens when the lines between the worlds are thinner, and that happens on the feast days. It happens strongest on Beltane, Samhain, and summer solstice. Now it's interesting because I told you that the fire feasts are feminine, are feminine in nature, and the sun feasts are masculine in nature. And it's funny because in the books, Claire and Galus and Bree all travel on fire feast days, either Samhain or Beltane. And the only person that travels on summer solstice is Roger. And that's a masculine day. So I just thought it was kind of interesting that, they traveled on the days that suit their sex. But anyway, okay, the triquetra. See this, this Celtic symbol that's in the center here? This is a very holy symbol in this time. because everything, the number 3 is a very sacred number, and everything kind of centered around this. You have your life, death, rebirth, mind, body, soul, air, earth, water. All of these things are everything that would flow out. Each one was attributed with certain attributes that you would seek out when you would pray to different points in the air and so forth. So all of these things combined, and this little center spot is your spirit. So how everything flows in through these other points, come into the center, and that's your spirit. Okay, on Samhain, the livestock, I was telling you about how it orientates on the animal cycle. On Samhain is when they would slaughter meat for the winter. On Imbolc, which means in the belly, and that's when the sheep are pregnant, they're giving milk, and the lambs will be born soon. That's what that's named after. Beltane is when animals meet. Now, Beltane is an interesting holiday. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And what they would do is they would put the animals through 2 giant fires for blessing. And this way, when they mate, they'd be extra fertile. This is what the thought process was for that. And then the Lunasa would connect plant and animal life because it celebrates the harvest, which feeds the animals. So that's what those days were for. It's a little bit about each holiday. And we continue with the mistletoe and Yule logs, which were used back then to banish evil, and the ghost spirits came during that time. And decorating trees came from representing foods. They would decorate the trees with foods that would sustain them through the winter as a way to celebrate, and now that's how we get decorating trees for Christmas. And in Imbolc, they celebrate feasts to Saint Bridget for fertility. Now in Scotland, as part of a Christian holiday, but it comes from this idea of when the lambs were pregnant. when the sheep were pregnant with the lambs. And then Ostera, they would that represented fertility and would be represented by the egg and the hare. And that was converted to an Easter tradition now. So all of these things were converted. I'm sorry?
That's really,
Yeah, that's
I realized that was for the Easter Bunny. Oh, wow. That's right.
So there were 2 what they call hinge feasts. Okay, the hinge feasts were Beltane, Samhain, okay, and they were the 1st of May and the 1st of November. And they were considered the hinge feasts because they marked the marking from spring to summer and from fall to winter, because they were like your 2 high points of the sun. Those one was when the sun was at its highest, one was like the death day where it was at its shortest. And the in-between times of where it would kick in from one equinox into those days, that was considered your really powerful days. And that was Samhain and Beltane. Okay? Now, in Beltane is a very, very powerful day. It's still celebrated huge in Scotland. There's huge, see this picture here is a current festival in Scotland for Beltane. And the idea, it's a very sexual holiday. It's considered, back in the time, they would have they would have sex on the different grounds for fertility and around the animals and around in stone circles, and it would be a mark to put the blessings of Mother Earth and the horned forest god into the earth and all of that. That's what it was based on. So it was celebrating fertility, and in the lore, the male horned god of the forest mates with Mother Earth, and that was was considered a time of great power, because it was when these 2 gods were mating, and it was this burst of fertility. And it was when the portals were very open during this time, and fires were all over to help banish spirits as well. Ghosts and fairies roam free, and The Celtic people were in awe of, like I said, times and places that fell in the in-between. The shore between land and water, bridges were also another sacred place, boundaries between territories, especially if there was a body of water that flowed on the boundary, that marked the boundary, that was considered an especially powerful place. That's why you'll hear the lore of a bad spirit can't cross water, because it has that power. That's what that's from. And thresholds and crossroads, things like that have a lot of lore around them and power because they're in between. This is important. The reason I'm dwelling on this is because the idea of the stones and the time travel is because that place in the stones is an in-between place. It's where a lot of places come together and meet. And a lot of powers of the earth come together and meet. And that's what gives it this power. And that's why it's important in this time period. Holy times were border times, so like dawn, twilight, those types of things where the sun went down, the sun came up, those were considered high power times. You would have bonfires the night before, and then you'd have the maypole dance and girls with the flowers in their hair and all of that, and the crowns of flowers that was all supposed to represent fertility and new birth, etc. So in ancient times, there was a human sacrifice to the fire for Beltane. What they would do is they would make something called the Beltane cake, and they would cut it into little pieces, and they would darken one piece with charcoal. And then they put it all in a bowl, and everybody would have to take their piece out of the bowl, and if you got the piece with the charcoal, you were sacrificed. So then later on, as they got less pagan, they would take that piece and you would run out, and then you would take a running start and you jump over the flames, and you do that 6 times, and that could be your way of escaping being sacrificed to the flames and still get the same power if you got the black piece. So you didn't want to get the black piece of Beltane cake. Let's see. Yeah. Summer solstice. This is the other big day. They call it spirit nights, Beltane, Samhain, and then summer solstice. And this is named after the light of the shore. Is what the Druids used to call it. And it's important because it was where earth, sky, and sea met. And so that was where, they would celebrate summer solstice a lot. And there's great power in those places on the shoreline. It's also a time to call magical herbs. And you'll see in the books, Roger and Claire have a conversation about this at one point. And she talks about how there's lore about you would pick certain herbs during the moonlight, and certain herbs during the height of the sun, and certain herbs on summer solstice and so forth, and it was supposed to make them more magical and powerful. And she said there's actual science behind it because, the sun, if you're in the sun longer, it gives off certain chemicals and certain herbs and makes them more potent and so forth, and that's why. Well, St. John's wort was one of those herbs. It was it was called the blessed herb, blessed plant. And it was renowned for bringing peace and prosperity to the house and the animals and the harvest. And so on this day is when it was at its most powerful because it gains power in sun. And so they would pick the herbs that St. John's wort on that day and throw it into the bonfires to promote blessing. Okay, so these two are like two of the lesser things. One is the Feast of the Bread, marks the harvest coming in, and that was one of the fire feasts, and the other one is Mabon, which is the autumn equinox. And these are all based around the harvest, okay? And that was a very important time, of course, because it was going to sustain them over winter. Then we get to Samhain. Okay, Samhain, which is now Halloween. This is an ancient Celtic fall harvest celebration, and was celebrated in Scotland on November 1st. marked the beginning of a new cycle of life and the beginning of the Celtic year. I put it last, but it really is technically first on the Celtic calendar. It's a festival to remember and honor the dead, and at Samhain, the veil that separates the world is again at its thinnest. So our world, fairy, dead, all blend as one world, and everything can cross over. Time loses meaning, and the past and present and future can connect. And it becomes very wrapped up in superstition even for Halloween. And on October 31st, evil spirits and souls of the departed would pass through the veil into the world of the living. And according to the cults, all different manner was abroad and connecting. People would light bonfires, and it would light the way for spirits to find their way into the world of the living. Food was left out to appease the spirits, and they believed that food was not left out for the spirits, then the spirits would play evil tricks for them. And that's where we get trick and treat, that's what they did. They would leave food out for these evil spirits to come and eat, so they would be satisfied, and they wouldn't play tricks on them. And that's where we get that tradition. Many of the Scots, there's different ways they would honor their own dead. Sometimes they would do something called a dumb supper, where they would have their supper in absolute silence, and they would have a place setting for a departed loved one that they would set up at the table without looking at it, because it would be considered disrespect. They would have this place setting there, no one would talk, they would be silent, and then after the supper was over, they would put the plate with the food outside to feed whatever spirits were remaining that didn't have whatever food was there. So that was one way they'd celebrate. It was also a time where they would appeal to their dead to grant, blessing or for guidance or something like that during that time, because they felt they were close by. Fairies also migrated from one place to another on Samhain night. So a lot of times if somebody believed that they had a loved one captured by the fairies, on Samhain night they have a chance of snatching them off the horse and keeping them off of the fairy horse and getting them back. And there's a famous tale, a Scottish tale called Camden, and it's a story of a young maiden who rescued her lover on Samhain night based on that piece of lore. Animals and food supplies would get special attention as well. They would be brought in during this time because this is a fire feast. It's based in, like I said, the animal world. So they would be brought in from their fields of grazing for their winter put down or for slaughter if they couldn't make it over the winter, if they were meant for slaughter and salting of meat. Then it was also a time of prophecy. And it was also a time where you would disguise yourself to avert evil, and that's where putting on costumes comes from. And you would do rituals for the dead. The witches which are in Scotland are called Bandrui. You'll hear them talk, you'll hear Jamie say that. People would call Claire that, Bandrui, because that's the word for witch in Scott and Gaelic. Would gather together and they would celebrate and prophesy and cast spells and so forth on Samhain. And those that had the second sight, which is Taishir, were often sought out that night to get fortunes told, to come to a gathering to tell their art, because they felt like they would be able to speak to the spirits easier on that day. Sometimes they would do a custom where they would put an egg in water, they'd poke a hole in the egg and let the contents drip into the water, and then they would look at the way it's swirled in the water and be able to tell a fortune or a future based on that, like the tea leaves would be. Okay, so it's also a time to ask for guidance. I know I'm going through this I'm like trying to race through it because I had moved this from last week, so I need to get it done quicker. So here we have the 4 seasons, which is the circle of life, and this is the idea that nature reflects life. So the life cycle of nature is like our life cycle, and they worshipped it that way. In the different seasons of the year, they would pray for different things that were connected to its life. Then you have the 4 Earths. You hear that expression with Jamie a lot. He's very, in the books, he's a lot more spiritual in the books than in the show. But in the books, you'd see he like would pray to the four airts. You would bless to the four airts. You'd walk in circles to the four airts, you know, and you would walk in circles has a power in a circle. Now, all of this is also connected to the Native American culture. They also do a lot with the four airts, okay, which is the north, south, east, west. And the direction you walked also mattered, because if you walked clockwise, which is sunwise, okay, that was to bring in blessing, bring in positivity, bring in good things, you know, into your life. It was to pray for things. If you were banishing evil, or you were trying to cast out a bad spirit, or you were trying to cast out a curse over your life or whatever, you would do the same. You would do your prayer in widdershins, which is counterclockwise. And that's the whole theory behind that. You'll see that a lot. If you read the books, you'll see like the idea of that a lot. You know, when Jamie sees Ronnie McNabb gets killed in the books, and they killed him as revenge for Jamie. And like horses wouldn't go near the grave and all this, and then he went over and he walked counterclockwise and did this prayer, and it was like to banish the evil. So that's what that's about. Earth's mysteries. Now here's where this is important because it connects with the time travel. First, the Druids and the Celts believed that all Earth was sacred, and they loved the land. They revered the spirit of a place. You'll hear Jamie talk a lot about that, what it is to know the spirit of a place. And that was very powerful, you know, as part of the Earth's power and magic. And you'll see he says that when he found Fraser's Ridge on the show. He's like, I can't tell you what it is to know the spirit of a place. It speaks to me, blah, blah, blah. That's what that comes from. And they believe that there are mysteries in the landscape. They'll look at certain rock formations or certain cliff faces. And then you saw that a lot with the Native American culture as well. They would worship at different certain rock formations and faces and so forth, because they believed that it had certain kinds of power attached to it. They also believed in ancient sites. There's a lot of that in the Scottish culture too, where you, like the Ninian Spring, where Dougal takes Claire and makes her drink out of it, and you can't lie when you drink out of this spring. Like, you know, all of these types of things, that's all part of Earth magic, okay? And Earth mysteries. One of the things was, you'll hear in some, even today, people believe in chakras, and believe in geoforce, and in Earth magnetic force and bioforce that comes in connection with the Earth magnetism. There's a word, I can't think of what the word is. It's like on the tip of my tongue. You know what I'm talking about?
Reiki.
Biorhythm, like, is that what I'm thinking of?
Reiki?
Reiki. But it connects with, you're supposed to be connected to certain points in the Earth, and you get triggered when you're in those points of the Earth for certain people, and different people respond to different parts of the Earth. This is what the time travel thing is kind of based on, because it's genetic, and a genetic person that's genetically disposed to time travel will react in these certain spots in the Earth that are marked with the stones.
Vortexes?
Vortex. Well, I'm going to get to that, but yeah, but there's a common belief about it, and maybe it's freaky, but I'm thinking of I don't know. But anyway, that's what the idea of it is. It's like a geomagnetism. And they also are, you'll see a lot of these people that are what they call dowsers, where they're looking for sensitivity for water. That comes into play in the books too as well. And that's also because they're trying to determine where there's underground water, not just for, they use it for wells, but those people that are sensitive to it are also because the underground running water is going to have power in it, you know. So Druids are also very interested in the concept of ley lines, earth chakras, and landscape temples for spiritual purposes. Others are interested in the history and archaeological dimensions of sacred sites, that comes into play later in the books as well. You'll see there's somebody that comes into their lives that is into archaeology. And I also think, a little theory, I think Uncle Lamb had an interest in it for this purpose too, because you know, Claire's time travel gene most likely comes through her father's side, and Uncle Lamb was her father's brother. So I'm kind of curious about that whole scenario, but we'll see how that comes out to be. Anyway, these include the exploration of electromagnetic forces, ultrasounds, acoustic properties of sites where you hear echoes in caves, different things like that. All of that has to do with certain belief systems as well. People that this picture here is where you get the idea of time travel. And I'm going to get into this when I talk about time travel. But where these points meet, these vortices, which is these are your I'm pointing like you're going to see me point. These are your magnetic lines that are going through the Earth, and different ones are different strengths, and where they come together at these points, that's where you supposedly have all of these like thin barriers between worlds and times, is where these vortices are. And that's where the stone circles would get erected, because they would notice a lot of things happening in this space, and they would mark it with the stone circles. Okay. Speaking of holidays, I just wanted to cover this while we're here. Scottish New Year is Hogmanay, and nobody really knows the origin of Hogmanay. There's a couple of theories. Some say that there was a Hogmanay the Terrible, which was a big Celtic tyrant of the 2nd century who used haggis as a way to rid himself from enemies. He would line his enemies up as haggis. And so people eat haggis to kind of commemorate him, apparently. And some say it means pig food, Hogmanay, for pig food. And that's why you eat haggis on that day. So whatever its origin, it's a big celebration in Scotland. It's the Scottish New Year, and there's a lot of different traditions that they do. One of them is the first foot, which you see happen in the books. And it's a customary practice where the best looking, darkest haired, tallest man, okay, is picked because that's the most lucky. A red-headed man is unlucky. So they would stick Jamie into a corner somewhere and tell him not to come out until after the first footing was over. And they got Roger in the books to do it. And so, you know, he would go, and it would be based on the first person to cross the threshold in the new year. Whoever that person was would determine the blessings you had that year. And they would bring salt and bread and different whiskey for meaning different types of blessings. So that's Hogmanay. It's an old custom in the Highlands. Also, another weird thing they would do on Hogmanay in the old days is they would take water from what they call living and dead ford, which means that whether you were living or dead ghosts could cross this particular river, and they would take water from that river, and they would sprinkle it all over the house, in the beds, you know, in every room. And then they would take all the windows and everything that had an open space in the house, and they'd shut it up, you know, so that no air could circulate into the house. And then they would get juniper branches, and they would light juniper branches and smoke out the house. And they would go, and everybody would have to stay in the house until they were gagging and choking on the smoke. And then when they couldn't take it anymore, and they couldn't breathe, and they were choking to death, and they couldn't take it anymore, then all of a sudden they could open the doors, let in the fresh air, and they would consider themselves cleansed of any spirits and blessings for the new year. That's a little crazy, but that's what they did. All right, folklore and storytelling. Storytelling is a strong presence in the Scottish Highlands for several centuries, and it's a big deal, the storytelling culture in the Highlands. And it's a way that they kept their histories. A big thing in the Highlands is for when, you know, and they talk about it in the books a little bit, how anytime you meet somebody, you would get their history. You find out who they're connected to, how they you know, how they got to know where they come from, where their people come from, who's related to who, and all this. It was like a common way they would greet each other, and so you knew who their people were, you know, and that's just part of the storytelling element of the Scottish people. They also had a lot of folklore stories, and there was a lot of lore that went with their stories. And what would happen is there was people called seneshes, and they were like the storytellers, and they became what was known as the bards, like Will and the Bard in Castle Leoch. And what they would do is these people that were called seneshes would go and collect stories and folktale and all of that, and they were like story collectors. They would go around from town to town to town, and they would tell their stories, and they would get new stories they hadn't heard, and they would add that to their collection. Roger somewhat becomes like that. Roger becomes one of these seneschals because he's always doing it. He's always talking to people and trying to get their tales and add them, write them down and add them to his book and build his collection. And that comes from a big Scottish custom of doing that. And then every laird had their own bard in their castle. You know, that was like considered a regular person you hired and had on hand. So it was a very big deal. And that was their form of entertainment. I mean, of course, this was before TV or any other thing, so they had no any other entertainment but to tell stories. And most of their stories were, aside from their historical stories, were folklore, legend, tales, witchcraft, monsters, all of this. And that became, because it was told a lot with their stories, it grew in as far as belief in them. So otherworld forces, fairies, specters, seers, monsters, moorland, hill, were very real to these people. And it's all they knew, you know. And as they said in the show, like, these people never traveled further than their own little area, their own little village. So, you know, they knew what they knew, and that's all they knew. So it was very, very closed-minded, very small world for these people. Okay, so I'm going to go through some of them, some of the different lore. So you have the Old Ones and the fairy folk and fairy hills. These were sacred ancient places where the fairies were supposed to live, and you weren't allowed to, you had to be very careful around them. You weren't supposed to disturb their places. You were supposed to, you know, go canny around a fairy hill or around fairy circles. Okay, they believe that the fairies lived, sometimes they believe the fairies lived underground, like they lived somehow inside of the hill. That's why a lot of times they thought Claire was a fairy, you know, because she came from the hill. So you need to respect them without disturbing their land. Changelings. A considerable amount of lore about the fairies revolves around changelings. And they were fairy children or adult male fairies that would disguise themselves as a child, because fairies could sometimes do like a glamour, you know, where they could take on form of something else. And they would leave the fairy in a child or the adult male disguised as a child so that he could suckle off of the mother. And they would take the baby, the regular baby, back to fairyland. And the lore would allow people to make excuses, or not excuses, but reasoning to make themselves feel better for children that had unexplained disorders or developmental disabilities, or had a birth defect or something like that, or something that would come about. They could say, oh, you know, that was a fairy child, that wasn't my child, and they had a way of making themselves cope with it. Okay, so now we get to the standing stones. So Diana says, every time I read about the stone circles, it would describe how they worked as an astronomical observance. For example, some of the circles are orientated so that at the summer solstice, the sun will strike a standing stone. But all the texts speculate that nobody knows what the actual function of these stone circles was. So I began thinking, well, I bet I can think of one. And so it began. Mrs. Graham in the show tells Frank about how the stones work, but their origins and mystical quality has caused a lot of people to wonder around the world. Most agree that they are connected somehow to a celestial spiritual ceremony based on the seasons. And some believe they were built by a race of giants or brought by a race of giants. Some believe that fairies threw stones or pebbles and they grew into these big giant stone circles. There's a lot of different superstitions and rituals and traditions that continue today. Superstitions that continue today. Even today, like on those days, Beltane, May Day, summer solstice, people gather around the stone circles. It's still incorporated in all of their festivities today. The Outlander works as a perfect vessel for all of for Claire to travel through stones. For Diana, utilizing the feast days and genetics, like Mrs. Graham said, on certain days for certain people, which is feast days and genetics, along with the druid fire rituals and dance and the celestial elements of the sun and the moon and the ley lines and the stone circles, all of this works together and helped her create this idea of traveling between realms and time travel. And it really works well for the book because it kind of blends science with lore, with things that are actually true. So it makes it where it's more believable when you read, like, really, like, you can do this almost as you're reading it. It becomes so real. We will discuss time travel itself in a little bit, but I'm just going to finish out with the lore and monsters and things like that you run across in Outlander. All of these things are connected to Outlander. That's why I'm telling you about them. They're all somewhat either show up or referenced. So I'm just getting you familiar with the lore. Okay, Selkies and Kelpies. First, we talk about Selkies. Okay, Selkies is northern dialect for seals. Okay, and a Selkie is an alluring, shape-shifting creature that comes out of the water, and it sheds its seal skin, and it's like considered very lustful and very alluring, and it's not an evil creature, okay, a Selkie, but it's considered like you can't resist it. You know, like a man could be lured by a female Selkie or vice versa. And I guess it was a good way to excuse if you cheated on your mate. Like, I was a victim of a Selkie, you know? And I guess that was supposed to give you a pass. But they would capture the hearts of human beings, and then sometimes they would even have children, supposedly, with them, and then they would miss the sea, and they would go back, and then they would come back once in a while to visit their children. Apparently, this is the lore behind it. And they can be very elegant. They have a lot of seductive power. They're very alluring, and they, they are morally conscious. They do really love the people they love, but they miss the sea, and they're always called back to the sea. And so, does anybody know how this is referenced in the Outlander world? The Selkies. You can just call out because I can't see well. So.
Didn't they think Brian?
Brian was a
Was a
Selkie, that's
Selkie.
right. They thought because Ellen, who was probably like the most sought after woman on the planet, it seems like, and all of the men wanted her, and her family had matches made for her, and everybody kind of constantly courted her. And along comes this guy out of nowhere and just gets her to elope with him, and she runs off with him, and she just falls head over heels for him. And he had this silky black hair. And it was like a little legend around, Brian was a Selkie that came out to sea and lured Ellen away. So that's where that legend comes into play. I just thought I'd tell you the background to it. A Kelpie is a water horse, but a Kelpie is more of a malevolent water horse. And it will emit a cry like it's drowning to lure people to it so it can drag them down to its death in the sea. Legend has it that you can defeat a Kelpie if you get a hold of its bridle, and then if you tear it off, he's subject to your command. So sometimes the Kelpie would stand by the shore and just look kind of like it's a totally innocent horse to get you to come over and just get on it voluntarily, and then it would drag you down into the sea. And so the Loch Ness Monster out there is considered a Kelpie. A lot of people consider that a Kelpie, and the Loch Ness Monster is a form of a water horse Kelpie story. Now, it's left out of the show, but in the first book, Claire encounters it. She's like along the Loch Ness, and this creature comes out of the sea, and it connects with her. And they lock eyes, and they almost kind of have an understanding between each other. And then it goes back into the sea after a minute or two, and into the river. And she turns, and somebody saw her there by the side of the water, and like freaked out because they saw her communing with this monster. And it ends up being somebody that testifies against her in the witch trial. They left this out. Maybe they didn't want to CGI with the thing or whatever, but they left it out of the show. But what's interesting is she has a conversation with Roger about it later, and I'm going to play that. It's going to be my Audible clip today. I'm going to play that in a bit when I talk about time travel. And it's interesting, her theory on it is that it was a dinosaur that time traveled, and that there's a portal at the bottom of Loch Ness. And that's the story of why the Loch Ness monster just comes up every once in a while and it's only visible once in a while. It kind of answers a lot of questions about it. And she talks to Roger about it while they're rowing on the Loch Ness. I'm going to play that clip for you because it covers a lot of things that I want to cover. But it's a 10-minute clip, so I'm going to make that our break time. If you don't want to hear the clip, you can go and take your break then. So the last piece I'm going to do on the lore is the Sin Eaters and the Knucklebees. Now, this is not in these seasons that we've covered so far. This is season 1 through 4. This is the Sin Eater comes into play, I think, in season 5, or it probably won't be in the show. And the Knucklebee comes into play in book 7. But this is the idea behind it. If you get into it or you find it, you run across it. When the Scots immigrated to the Appalachian area, because you still see this legend today, the Sin Eater. When they emigrated to the Appalachian area, they brought this custom with them. And the idea was that the Sin Eater was this very reviled person, like a beggar that no one talked to. You never looked at him in the face. You stayed away from him because he was considered kind of holding on to evil, And what they would do is if someone died, and they didn't have a chance because they were out there in the mountains away from everybody, and so there wasn't a priest and all that nearby, so they couldn't get last rites. A person in the family that would die, they would go and pay a very small fee to the Sin Eater. They would summon him. Usually there was like a signal system in place. He would come. They would put bread and sometimes a little glass of whiskey or something on top of the person that died while they're laying there. The bread was supposed to absorb the last sins of the person that died, and then the Sin Eater would come, not talk to anybody, say a little prayer or something, at the silent prayer, take the food off of the dead person and eat it, and he was consuming the final sins of that person so that person could go to heaven, and then he would leave. And so basically, he's damning himself with all these people's final sins, and he's also reviled and no one talks to him. So that's the legend of the Sin Eater. And then Knucklebee he's like the most horrific creature of the northern Scottish Isles. His breath would kill all of the fields. If you breathed on your fields would all die, your crops would all die. And he was very, very scary. He was a sea creature. The way to defeat him is he couldn't cross fresh flowing water. So if you were being chased by a Knucklebee, you would run it to the nearest stream you could find and cross over it, and then he would be able to follow you. So that was the only way to be pursued of a Knucklebee. So that's my little venture into lore. Time travel facts. Time travel is a genetic trait. Dates back to Master Raymond in 3000 and 4000 BC. Time travel is most open on Sun and Fire feasts, especially Beltane, Samhain, and summer solstice. Stone circles mark where time travel is possible. These sacred places exist all around the world, and as we said, we think it's where those ley lines meet here in these vortices. The usual time without any steering is 200 years, and tools for travel. Gold and silver provide safety and guard against physical dangers. Mythically, the gold represents the power of the sun, and the silver represents the power of the moon. Scientifically, these elements may be conductors to allow a smoother flow of energy. Gemstones burn up during passage, but they can provide for safety, and different gemstones can aid in power and control with steering. There's also theories that travelers can at times sense and recognize each other and can draw additional power from each other's magnetic energy, which I talked about with Claire. Also, you focus your mind on the person you have strong feelings for, and that person's energy will help pull you to them. That's an additional element. Time travel experience. One area where this show fails a little bit is in the time travel experience. They kind of make it look like nothing on the show, and it's actually quite horrific. And there's it's very indescribable how people have died, have had heart attacks. They've been found burnt at the face of the stones. The first time Roger traveled, he got kicked down and he was on fire, and Fiona had to throw coffee on. This is in the books. Fiona had to throw coffee on him to put the fire out because you can't exist in a time period you already existed, and he thought about his father when he was a baby, and it ended up being trying to pull him into that time where he already lived, and that's what kicked him out, and he was on fire. Each trip is worse, and a lot of times people have been caught in they just disappear because they can't get out, and they're caught in the in-between places. And Claire describes hearing screams and people inside that are stuck in this vortex and don't come out. The physical effects is a very horrible, indescribable noise inside. On one approach, they hear different noises depending on which one they come to. Sometimes it's buzzing, sometimes it's humming, sometimes it's like a singing, high-pitched tone, or nothing at all. When the ports are narrow, that there's nothing at all. There's a feeling of being pulled apart on an atomic level, blinding light, hearing screams of others, feeling presences pulling you, and you get drugged sometimes. There was a scene where Roger was being pulled by Galus. When Galus went through, he started being pulled, and I think it's because they're related. Maybe there was a blood connection that was dragging him into it, but he was holding on to the dirt and the grass and everything, and then Bree ends up trying to pull him back. So it's a lot more rough, and the show kind of makes it look like, touch the stone, I wake up on the grass, everything's honky-dory, but and I've had some people that just watch the show say, well, why didn't she just go back afterwards? And why don't they just hop back and forth? They don't get how traumatic it is and dangerous it is. So, but that's...
I had to skip this this Audible clip for the class because we were running a little over time. However, I wanted to include it here for the YouTube video. And basically what you have happening in this clip is from season 3, and Roger and Bree and Claire have been searching for Jamie, and they have traced him all the way through Ardsmuir, and they've traced him, I believe, to Hellwater, and then they lost track of him. So they were taking a break and going on a rowing trip on the Loch Ness for the day. And Roger is in a place, this is great because you get Roger's point of view, and Roger's in a place where he's starting to realize how much he truly cares about Brianna, and he truly is starting to really love her. At the same time, Claire is contemplating whether or not, now that they're getting close, is she going to go back? And they were talking about men and the advantages of tall men versus short men, and that's where this conversation picks up. And I like this clip because it touches on a lot of things we discussed: the danger of the stones. It talks about the idea of the Loch Ness monster and the way the portals work. It talks about the trip and the passage and how difficult it is. It talks about a lot of the things we discussed in the lore. So hope you enjoy this clip.
Looked out over the dark waters of the loch, shading her eyes with her hand. She might have been keeping an eye out for otters and floating logs, but Roger thought that far-seeing gaze was looking a bit farther than the cliffs of the opposite shore. "You like men, don't you?" he said quietly. "Tall men." She smiled briefly, not looking at him. "One," she said softly. "Will you go, then, if I can find him?" He rested his oars momentarily, watching her. She drew a deep breath before answering. The wind flushed her cheeks with pink and moulded the fabric of the white shirt to her figure, showing off a high bosom and a slender waist. Too young to be a widow, he thought. too lovely to be wasted. I don't know, she said a little shakily. The thought of it, or rather the thoughts of it. On the one hand, to find Jamie, and then, on the other, to go through again. A shudder went through her, closing her eyes. It's indescribable, you know, she said, eyes still closed, as though she saw inside them the ring of stones on Craigna Dun. Horrible, but horrible in a way that isn't like other horrible things, so you can't say. She opened her eyes and smiled wryly at him. A bit like trying to tell a man what having a baby is like. He can more or less grasp the idea that it's painful, but he isn't equipped actually to understand what it feels like. Roger grunted with amusement. Oh, aye? Well, there's some difference, you know. I've actually heard those bloody stones. He shivered himself involuntarily. The memory of the night 3 months ago when Gillian Edgars had gone through the stones wasn't one he willingly called to mind. It had come back to him in nightmares several times, though. He heaved strongly on the oars, trying to erase it. Like being torn apart, isn't it? He said, his eyes intent on hers. There's something pulling at you, ripping, dragging, and not just outside. Inside you as well, so you feel your skull will fly to pieces any moment. And the filthy noise. He shuddered again. Claire's face had gone slightly pale. I didn't know you could hear them, she said. You didn't tell me. It didn't seem important. He studied her a moment as he pulled, then added quietly, Bree heard them as well. I see. She turned to look back over the loch, where the wake of the tiny boat spread its V-shaped wings. Far behind, the waves from the passage of a larger boat reflected back from the cliffs, and joined again in the centre of the loch, making a long, humped form of glistening water. A standing wave. A phenomenon of the loch that had often been mistaken for a sighting of the monster. It's there, you know, she said suddenly, nodding down into the black, peat-laden water. He opened his mouth to ask what she meant, but then realised that he did know. He had lived near Loch Ness for most of his life, fished for eels and salmon in its waters, and heard, and laughed at, every story of the fearsome beastie that had ever been told in the pubs of Drumnadrochit and Fort Augustus. Perhaps it was the unlikeliness of the situation, sitting here, calmly discussing whether the woman with him should or should not take the unimaginable risk of catapulting herself into an unknown past. Whatever the cause of his certainty, it seemed suddenly not only possible, but sure, that the dark water of the loch hid unknown but fleshly mystery. "What do you think it is?" he asked, as much to give his disturbed feelings time to settle, as out of curiosity. Claire leaned over the side, watching intently as a log drifted into view. "The one I saw was probably a plesiosaur," she said at last. She didn't look at Roger, but kept her gaze astern, though I didn't take notes at the time. Her mouth twisted in something not quite a smile. "How many stone circles are there?" she asked abruptly. "In Britain? In Europe? Do you know?" "Not exactly. Several hundred, though," he answered cautiously. "Do you think they're all—" "How should I know?" she interrupted impatiently. "The point is, they may be. They were set up to mark something, which means there may be the hell of a lot of places where that something has happened." She tilted her head to one side, wiping the wind-blown hair out of her face, and gave him a lopsided smile. "That would explain it, you know." "Explain what?" Roger felt fogged by the rapid shifts of her conversation. "The monster." She gestured out over the water. "What if there's another of those places, under the loch? A time corridor, passage, whatever." Roger looked out over the purling wake, staggered by the idea. It would explain a lot. There was a smile hiding at the corner of her mouth, behind the veil of blowing hair. He couldn't tell whether she was serious or not. The best candidates for monster are all things that have been extinct for hundreds of thousands of years. If there's a time passage under the loch, that would take care of that little problem. It would also explain why the reports are sometimes different, Roger said, becoming intrigued by the idea. If it's different creatures who come through. And it would explain why the creature or creatures haven't been caught and aren't seen all that often. Maybe they go back the other way too, so they aren't in the loch all the time. What a marvellous idea, Roger said. He and Claire grinned at each other. You know what? She said. I'll bet that isn't going to make it on the list of popular theories. Roger laughed, catching a crab, and droplets of water sprayed over Brianna. She snorted, sat up abruptly, blinking, then sank back down, face flushed with sleep, and was breathing heavily within seconds. She was up late last night, helping me box up the last set of records to go back to the University of Leeds, Roger said, defensive on her behalf. Claire nodded abstractedly, watching her daughter. Jamie could do that, she said softly. Lie down and sleep anywhere. She fell silent. Roger rode steadily on, toward the point of the loch where the grim bulk of the ruins of Castle Urquhart stood amid its pines. The thing is, Claire said at last, it gets harder. Going through the first time was the most terrible thing I'd ever had happen to me. Coming back was 1,000 times worse. Her eyes were fixed on the looming castle. I don't know whether it was because I didn't come back on the right day. It was Beltane when I went, and 2 weeks before when I came back. Gillian, she went on Beltane too. In spite of the heat of the day, Roger felt slightly cold, seeing again the figure of the woman who had been both his ancestor and his contemporary, standing in the light of a blazing bonfire, fixed for a moment in the light, before disappearing forever into the cleft of the standing stones. That's what her notebook said, that the door is open on the sun feasts and the fire feasts. Perhaps it's only partly open as you near those times. Or perhaps she was wrong altogether. After all, she thought you had to have a human sacrifice to make it work. Claire swallowed heavily. The petrol-soaked remains of Greg Edgars, Gillian's husband, had been recovered from the stone circle by the police on May Day. The record concluded of his wife only, fled, whereabouts unknown. Claire leaned over the side, trailing a hand in the water. A small cloud drifted over the sun, turning the loch a sudden grey, with dozens of small waves rising on the surface as the light wind increased. Directly below, in the wake of the boat, the water was darkly impenetrable. 700 feet deep is Loch Ness, and bitter cold. What can live in a place like that? "Would you go down there, Roger?" she asked softly. "Jump overboard, dive in, go on down through that dark until your lungs were bursting, not knowing whether there are things with teeth and great heavy bodies waiting?" Roger felt the hair on his arms rise, and not only because the sudden wind was chilly. "But that's not all the question," she continued, still staring into the blank, mysterious water. "Would you go, if Brianna were down there?" She straightened up and turned to face him. "Would you go?" The amber eyes were intent on his, unblinking as a hawk's. He licked his lips, chapped and dried by the wind, and cast a quick look over his shoulder at Brianna sleeping. He turned back to face Claire. "Yes, I think I would." She looked at him for a long moment, and then nodded, unsmiling. "So would I."
Okay, that was the clip for the Loch Ness Audible clip. Hope you enjoyed that. Gives you a good idea of a lot of different areas that we discussed. I'm going to go back to the lecture, and I'm going over a couple of the rules for time travel, and then we'll be done this segment. The next segment, which is the second half of the second week, will be focused on a lot of the foundational work for season 1, characters, themes, etc. And that'll be the second half of the second week. But thank you for listening. Bye.
The rules that I see for the timeline is that it's a single timeline. This is all kind of conjecture, but this is how I see it. That when Claire was born, her past already happened and already recorded. In an older version of her, it's like one big timeline, much like God views time, and there is no past, present, future with God, in Christianity view, so it's kind of like that. And Claire lives a single lifeline herself, but her older self existed in the past. There's free will, but what you freely choose is already part of your past. You can affect small things as your role in an event, but the large events were made by a number of decisions, so you're not going to change those. You can't exist twice in the same time period. You can't travel or remain in a time where you already exist. So if you travel to a time and then you're going to be born like 2 years later, you got to get out of that time before you're born, and you're probably, I don't really know what's going to happen, but you're going to probably die, because you can't exist twice. It's difficult to go forward because you have nobody to focus on because you don't know what's forward. So that's why when Galis was going to travel forward back to her time, she had to picture a Brie to have something to have focus for, to picture her, because she's going to a time that she hasn't been in yet, so she didn't really know, you don't know what you don't know, So it's harder to go forward.